There is a word the British wrote in Jamaican ledgers for 150 years, and it made them nervous every time. Coromantee. They wrote manuals about it. They held meetings about it. There are documents where planters openly argue about whether they should stop buying these people entirely, because of what these people kept doing to them. And they never stopped. They could not stop. 15 surnames. 15 parishes that bought from that coast harder than anywhere else in the Caribbean. And what the ledgers say came off those ships. Now, somebody is already typing it, and they're right too. So let's settle it before we start. A surname can't tell you your bloodline. The name came from the estate. You've said so yourself. Correct. It did. And I have. So here is exactly what I'm claiming, and exactly why. Your surname doesn't carry your ancestry. Your surname carries your parish. And for these 15 names, the parish is not a 50-50. It's not a spread. In the western end of Jamaica, across the decades these families were registered, the overwhelming majority of every human being landed on those estates came through one stretch of coast. The Gold Coast forts at Kormantse and its neighbours. Not most years, nearly every year, for a century and a half. When a population is fed from one source that heavily, for that long, and then intermarries within the same parish for 6 more generations, you are not looking at a possibility anymore. You are looking at arithmetic. That's the claim. Parish, corridor, time, arithmetic. Nothing about DNA kits and nothing invented. And the warrior's part isn't decoration either. I'll show you why in about 4 minutes. Here's what most people never got told. Coromantee was never the name of a people. It was the name of a fort, Kormantse, on the coast of what is now Ghana. The British used it as a shipping label for everyone loaded there. Ashanti, Fante, Denkyira, Akwamu, and people from far inland. So it's a port of departure, not a bloodline. Anybody who tells you Coromantee was a tribe hasn't read the documents. But here's the thing that makes the label useful anyway. Everyone shipped through Kormantse came out of Akan country, and Akan country ran on war. The Ashanti Empire destroyed Denkyira in 1701 and absorbed it. Akwamu fell in 1730. The Fante states on the coast fought Ashanti for generations. And the losers of those wars were the cargo. That is not a metaphor, and it is not my interpretation. It is how the trade functioned. African states fought. Captives were taken, captives were sold at the coast. So the people coming through that fort were disproportionately soldiers. Men and women from societies organized around military rank, who had been on the losing side of a battle 3 months earlier. The planters imported defeated armies. Then they put them on adjoining properties, thousands at a time, and acted surprised for 100 years. 15 surnames, counting down. Stay for number 2, because that family came ashore with the invasion fleet in 1655 and ended up in the single most Gold Coast-heavy parish on the island, which means their ledger and their rebellion records are the same document. And number 1 is a name carried by the first Jamaican ever to win an Olympic gold medal. What his parish records say about where his people came from is the reason this video ends where it does. Before we start, comment your surname and your parish, and your district if you know it. Content, Retreat, Newmarket, Katadupa, 9 Mile. Parish is everything in this video. A Graham out of Trelawny and a Graham out of St. Thomas are looking at coasts 1,500 kilometers apart. Nearly every name on this list came out of that comment section. The next one will too. Number 15. Bygrave. Bygrave is English and topographic. from living by a grove or a ditch. In England, it is scarce. In Jamaica, it is scarcer. And that is exactly why it's useful. It sits in the western parishes, and rare names in Jamaica behave differently from common ones. A smith has 300 estates to search. A bygrave has 3. Which means if you carry this name, you can realistically find the property. Not the region, the property. Number 14. Pusey is English, from a place in Berkshire. And in Jamaica, it concentrates in St. Elizabeth and Westmoreland, the deep south and the western tip. St. Elizabeth bought through the Gold Coast forts more consistently than almost anywhere in the Caribbean. And on its northern edge sits a kampong, the maroon town founded by people who got off the estates and were never brought back, named for the brother of Cujo. The British signed a treaty with a kampong in 1739 because they could not win. It is still there. It still marks that treaty every January the 6th. Same parish, same ancestry, one side registered as property, one side never on the list at all. Number 13, chambers. Chambers is occupational, a chamberlain, someone who managed a household. It spreads across the western and central parishes, and it's one of those ordinary English names that ended up far more common in Jamaica than in most of England. That's a pattern you'll see 4 or 5 times in this video. Names didn't spread from Britain to Jamaica. In a lot of cases, they relocated. They left the place that made them and became more Jamaican than English within 2 generations. Number 12, Sutherland. Sutherland comes from the far north of Scotland. So far north, the Norse called it the Southern Land, because it was south of Orkney. It arrives with the 18th century Scottish influx. By the late 1700s, roughly a third of white men in Jamaica were estimated to be Scots, overseers, bookkeepers, attorneys. In Jamaica, it lands across Hanover and Westmoreland, the far western tip. And Hanover's records are among the most concentrated on the island. Gold Coast, year after year, decade after decade. A name from the top of Scotland, on the population drawn most tightly from one African coast. Number 11, Cunningham. Cunningham is from Ayrshire in southwest Scotland. Same century, same mechanism, same landing zone. Hanover and the West. And in 1776, a conspiracy was uncovered in Hanover, a rising planned across multiple estates, organized in secret by people the records call Coromantee. It was discovered before it began, and the response was brutal. But think about what organizing it required. People on separate properties, coordinating without writing across a parish. That's only possible if they shared a language and understood the same chain of command, which they did, because the planters had spent 70 years buying from the same coast. They built their own problem, one purchase at a time. That's the second time I've said that in this video, and it won't be the last. And that's still the small stuff. The next 4 names sit in the parishes where it actually broke. Number 10, Forbes is from Aberdeenshire, a Highland name from the Gaelic for a field. It spreads through Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth, the southwest. And Westmoreland is the parish that came closest to taking the island. When the rising of 1760 spread out of St. Mary, the phase that landed in Westmoreland was larger and lasted longer than the original. Hundreds of people, organized, holding out for months in country the militia could not control. Westmoreland's registers point overwhelmingly to the Gold Coast. The same forts, the same label in the ledger. Number 9, Facey. Facey is one of the most recognizably Jamaican surnames on this list. It comes from an English nickname, from a word for face, and it barely survives in England at all. In Jamaica, it concentrates in Westmoreland and Manchester. And here's a thing worth understanding about that combination. Manchester didn't exist until 1814, It was carved out of Clarendon, St. Elizabethanvere 3 years before the registers began, which means Manchester families almost always arrive from a neighboring parish, carrying an ancestry that was already established somewhere else. If your name is Facey and your people are Manchester, your trail runs through the southwest first. That's not a dead end. That's an instruction. Number 8. Wallace Wallace is Scottish, and it means, literally, the foreigner. From the same root as Welsh, a name given to Britons who weren't Anglo-Saxon. It settles across the western parishes, and it carries the same Gold Coast profile as everything else on that end of the island. But sit with the etymology for a second. A name that means outsider, given by one conquered people to another, carried across the Atlantic, and landing on the descendants of people taken from a third continent entirely. 3 layers of somebody else's conquest, stacked in one word. Number 7. Graham is a border name, from Grantham in Lincolnshire, then a Scottish clan on the frontier. In Jamaica, it's everywhere, but it's thickest in Trelawny and St. James, the northwest. Trelawny borders the cockpit country, limestone sinkholes and blind valleys where a column of soldiers can simply vanish. Trelawny town was a leeward maroon settlement. The British fought them, lost, and signed a treaty in 1739, then fought them again in 1795. And when that second war ended, the British deported them, first to Nova Scotia, then in 1800 to Sierra Leone, shipped back across the exact ocean their grandparents had been dragged over to the same coast by the same empire as punishment for refusing to be owned. Trelawny's estates bought Coromantee in some of the highest concentrations recorded anywhere in the Americas. The planters knew precisely what they were handling. It is why the great houses in that parish were built with gun loops in the walls. Number 6. Hamilton. Hamilton is one of the great Scottish names, from a place in Leicestershire that became a ducal house in Lanarkshire. In Jamaica, it sits in St. James and along the northwest coast. And St. James is where it ended. Christmas, 1831. A Baptist deacon named Samuel Sharp organized what was supposed to be a peaceful general strike. The enslaved population of the parish would simply not return to the fields after the holiday. It became the Baptist War. Around 60,000 people. The largest uprising in the history of the British Caribbean. It was put down with extraordinary violence, and Sharp was hanged in the square at Montego Bay in May 1832. 14 months later, Parliament passed the Abolition Act. St. James bought through the Gold Coast forts as heavily as any parish on the island. That is not a coincidence anybody needs to argue about. It is a purchase pattern and a rebellion pattern sitting on top of each other on the same map. Number 5. Malcolm. Malcolm is Gaelic, Mael Colwyn, meaning devotee of St. Columba. 4 kings of Scotland carried it. In Jamaica, it lands in Hanover and Westmoreland, the far west, in the heart of the Gold Coast corridor. And here's the piece of Akan society that matters most for understanding what happened in these parishes. It was matrilineal. Inheritance, political legitimacy, and clan membership ran through the mother's line. Now think about Nanny, the only woman among Jamaica's 7 national heroes, commanding the Windward Maroons and forcing a British treaty. Think about how many Jamaican families are still, functionally, organized around grandmothers. The planters recorded that structure in their own manuals as a curiosity. They never worked out that they had imported a system of authority, not just a workforce. Number 4. Murray. Murray is from Moray in northeast Scotland, one of the largest and oldest of the Highland names. In Jamaica, it's concentrated in Westmoreland and Hanover. Gold Coast, again, relentlessly. And this is the point in the video to say the quiet part clearly. There are Jamaican colonial documents in which planters weigh, in writing, whether the risk of buying Coromantee was worth it. They had watched 1739. They had watched 1760. They knew exactly which parishes their trouble came from and exactly which fort those people had been loaded at. And they kept buying. Because the same qualities they were afraid of, discipline, organization, physical capacity, a command structure, were the qualities they were paying for. They could not separate the labor from the soldier. Nobody could. They were the same people. Number 3, Nemhard. Nemhard is about as Jamaican as a surname gets. It exists in Britain barely at all. In Jamaica and its diaspora, it's carried by thousands, concentrated in Manchester and St. Elizabeth. Rare, concentrated, traceable. If you're a Nemhard, every other Nemhard you meet is almost certainly a relative within a handful of generations. And the estate records for those 2 parishes are a realistic afternoon's work, not a lifetime's. Southern uplands, Gold Coast corridor, and on the northern edge, a Kompong again. Number 2, Vassal. The Vassal family came ashore with the English invasion fleet in 1655, not investors, soldiers, and took land in the first wave of grants. The name has been in Jamaica for 370 years. It is one of the oldest continuously present surnames on the island, and today it is carried overwhelmingly by Black Jamaicans across Westmoreland and the West, which means the Vassal Ledger and the Westmoreland Rebellion record are, in effect, the same archive. Every uprising in that parish, 1760, the long resistance after it, took place on properties held by families like this one, worked by people bought through Kormantse. The family came to take a fortune and go home. Almost all of them did. The name never left. And number 1. Wint is a short, hard, unusual name. English in origin, from a personal name, and one of those that all but disappeared in Britain while thriving here. It concentrates in Manchester, in the southern uplands. And in 1948, at the London Olympics, a man from Plowden, Manchester, ran the 400 meters and became the first Jamaican in history to win an Olympic gold medal. Arthur Wint. He was a Royal Air Force pilot in the Second World War. He became a doctor. He later served as Jamaica's High Commissioner in London. He was, by every account of everyone who met him, the most gracious man in any room he entered. 14 years before Jamaica was a country, he stood on a podium, and the crowd had to work out which flag to raise. Manchester's ancestry is inherited from St. Elizabeth and Clarendon, the Gold Coast corridor, arriving second-hand from the parishes that were buying hardest. So, the first Jamaican to win an Olympic gold came out of the same corridor as the Maroon Wars, as 1760, as Sam Sharp. Same coast, same records, different century, and this time, the whole world was watching on purpose. That's what the word Coromantee is actually pointing at. Not a tribe, not a legend, 150 years of one coast feeding one island, and everything that island has produced since. That's the thing nobody tells you about these records. Every line was written by someone who thought they were doing bookkeeping. The word Coromantee is in those ledgers because a buyer wanted to know what he was getting, and because he was frightened of the answer. Not one word of it was meant for us, and it is the only reason any of this is recoverable. The system that tried to make your family anonymous wrote down the fort, the parish, the estate, and the year. It couldn't help itself. Now it's evidence. So let me be straight with you one more time, the way I was at the start. I can't hand you a birth certificate. Nobody can. And anybody who says they can is selling you something. What I can hand you is a purchase record, a parish, and 150 years of the same coast. And tell you honestly that when the arithmetic is that lopsided for that long, the word for what you're looking at stops being maybe. Comment your surname, your parish, your district. Everything here turns on it. They wrote the word down because they were afraid of it. Turns out they were right to be.